What a lot of people, though, are looking at, particularly in the minority community, is whether or not this will lead to a re-examination of race by whites, not just by minorities. We've known for many, many years that blacks and Latinos have thought one thing about the criminal justice system that differed from whites, that there was a greater distrust on the part of the police, for instance, a distrust in the criminal justice system, again, because they either had known people or themselves been victimized by the system. And so when you have a reaction to the O.J. Simpson trial, some of what you're seeing is really that.
But when you say a change in the white community, like what? I mean, what can you do?
Well, I think the question really comes to, do you really believe that racism still exists? And I think that that's the fundamental issue that has been taken on. Many, many years have gone past in terms of this polarization between whites and blacks. The polarization has continued, but I think for a lot of people, there was a greater belief that it really wasn't there any longer, but in fact it really has been there just underneath the surface.
I agree with you. You're certainly on the right track. It does whites no good to say it's an awful verdict. He was guilty. Yeah, I think he was guilty, but the jury said otherwise. All these years that white juries have been railroading black defendants in. Now, I agree with Bill Bennett. Two wrongs don't make a right. But if whites just to say, all right, let's see how we can change the jury system. Now, all things start in California, and already there's a movement there to say, let's just make it 10-2, for instance, of unanimous. That's the wrong approach. That just gets us deeper, as Lyndon Johnson would say, into the big muddy, and not help.
Well, as a legal matter, I gotta say, though, just because this verdict was not guilty, that strikes me as an inappropriate time to say, aha, let's revamp the jury system. Now, if it had been a guilty or a mistrial, would we still be having that kind of conversation?
I didn't see whites say, let's revamp the jury system, when in Simi Valley, the almost all-white jury let the cops off. Whites thought that was just fine.
Well, I don't think that's entirely true.
No,
I think there was a lot of,
and
I think that's part of what's going on here in the upset of this past week. Is there were a lot of people very upset about that verdict in Simi Valley, a lot of white people, and I think that if Mark Furman goes to trial, and as he should for perjury, and he's let off, that there'd be a lot of white people upset about that too. I think that what this past week sort of took us all aback on was that there were not very many, certainly in the polls, of black people saying, gee, that's a lousy verdict.
Does the name Yankel Rosenbaum ring a bell?
Sure, exactly.
Absolutely.
Okay. That's the man who's killed in essentially a pogrom, a riot, African Americans against Jews in Brooklyn. The killer was caught. Had the victim's blood on him, had the murder weapon on
Eyewitness.
him, bragged to people, eyewitnesses. A jury of 9 blacks and 3 Puerto Ricans acquitted him and then held a party for him. This is happening in America, and it's in start in Los Angeles. What is alarming to people is the prevalence of group thinking. It's not as though we don't think about race in this country. We think of little else, it seems to me. And what alarms some of us is the government, public policies seem to encourage this now, that it is lucrative to organize yourself into a grievance group and acquire victim status and think not of individuals, but of representatives of blocks.
But why do people organize themselves into grievance groups? Because they have grievances. And usually because there have been things in the past that lead to these grievances, George. To argue these individual cases, and you're right in that case, to argue the individual injustices is not going to get us anywhere. How do we get out of, do we have to wait for several generations before everybody lives together and trusts the police?
Well, first of all, the police is sort of a separate question. I do think the LAPD is just, it's unbelievable. They have commission after commission. They pay millions and millions of dollars in damages and penalties, and nothing seems to get better in the LAPD. I mean, that seems to be just a world of its own. I gather from many people tell me a lot of other police forces are just as bad, but that one seems to come up with it over and over again.
Well, I think that gets back to the heart of what happened in this case. I think it's very disturbing for a lot of minority people to see the diminution of the jury's decision and somehow assess that to groupthink, or even, as Gil Garcetti said, just a decision based on emotion, when in fact there were some problems with the handling of the evidence. You can argue whether or not the majority of whites in this country believed O.J. Simpson was innocent until proven guilty. You can also question whether or not black people in particular, but also there were 2 whites and a Latino person on this jury, believe that there are different standards of reasonable doubt that flows through their mind than what may flow through some of your mind.
I want to get to this question that we were talking with our guest about. What does it mean for Colin Powell? Now, we did have these conflicting images at the same time of people sort of glomming onto Colin Powell and then having this deep division over this verdict.
Well, I'll tell you, I think the reason many of us think Colin Powell would make a good president is because he's someone with a background and an experience and an ability and a maturity rather than he is black. I would think in the long run, after the few weeks, it will mean nothing to Colin Powell. He will either rise or fall on those attributes or lack of them rather than he is African-American or he's not.
I found interesting what Bill Bennett said today, which is that this has hurt him. And there should be a re-examination of why that is. Already, there's a new Time poll that comes out tomorrow, in tomorrow's editions of Time, that says the country is evenly split over the question of whether or not Colin Powell would be a unifying force in bridging the racial divide. However, you could also ask the question, should he bear that burden any more than, say, should Bill Clinton or should Bob Dole? And perhaps you could come to the conclusion the answer should
leaders are hired to lead, of course.
Absolutely, but should he, because he's a black man of West Indian descent, be somehow more able to bring us together than Bill Clinton or Bob Dole? And I think the answer to that should be no.
It's one thing to ask Colin Powell to lead, which you ask of any political leader. It's another thing to ask him to be a reforming, transforming role model who by his mere presence is going to alter the behavior of what disturbs Americans.
But in fact, he's been that his whole life. I mean, he can't avoid it.
I understand that, but then if he goes into office with people saying, well, he's there, and by being there, he's going to have a transforming effect, there's country setting itself up for a terrible disappointment and putting
Colin Powell in an untenable
position.
Look at what John Kennedy did. He became the first Catholic to become president of the United States after the Al Smith run, in which many people believe that Smith was hurt badly by the anti-Catholicism of the day. It was a breakthrough there. I would think from now on, people don't check to see whether someone's a Catholic or not. There are still some bars to some religions, and of course now we're talking about a bar, and women, if we want to include you, who are the majority in this country, still a bar. So I think from the standpoint of, if Colin Powell were elected president for the right reasons, that is that we believe that he is the best person to lead, and the additional benefit is that we break the bar of color, I think that's just another plus.
Well, it's an appropriate place to stop is on the question of a Catholic Pope, going back to a Catholic Pope.